Before power was measured in market share, it was measured in territory. Let's review the ultimate strategists. Some rulers inherited not a unified machine, but a table full of ambitious partners who could obey, bargain, stall, or walk away. The historical puzzle is not just who prevailed, but how did leaders hold together a coalition of rivals who could have simply walked away or turned against them? At first glance, the answer can look personal, as if one stronger figure simply outmaneuvered weaker rivals and the rest of the system followed. The pressure is immediate. That explanation is too thin for the pressure we are studying, because effective leadership over a fragmented coalition may depend less on issuing stronger commands and more on structuring incentives so rival factions keep finding. So the promise of this episode is a structural reading of power, legitimacy, and institutional durability, not another heroic summary of events. The pressure is immediate. The structure is exposed. How did leaders hold together a coalition of rivals who could have simply walked away or turned against them? That is the tension the institution has to absorb before uncertainty becomes political opportunity. The problem begins when a fragmented political order gives every major faction both a reason to cooperate and a reason to test the center whenever the bargain feels uneven. Once that happens, leadership becomes a test of architecture, not charisma, because every layer below the center starts judging what still deserves obedience. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The relevant distinction is the difference between hierarchical obedience and negotiated cooperation among actors who retain meaningful leverage. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating at the same time. When that distinction is blurred, people often misread a structural weakness as a personal drama and then miss the mechanism actually driving the instability. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. That is why the stakes are broader than one ruler, one faction, or one disputed decision. If the coalition collapses, the center does not just lose prestige. Everyone starts recalculating. If authority leans too heavily on presence alone, the institution eventually discovers how little of itself it can carry without constant personal intervention. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The lens here is coalition management theory, and the point of that lens is to separate visible command from the quieter structures that make command durable. The distinction matters here. Coalition management theory, how selective concession, reciprocal obligation, autonomy, and controlled competition can keep rivals cooperating without full centralized control. The distinction matters here. The mechanism is becoming clearer. In conceptual terms, this mechanism matters because leadership can appear strongest precisely where the institution underneath it is least prepared to function alone. The distinction matters here. The mechanism is becoming clearer. The goal is not to pretend every historical setting is the same. It is to see where the same kind of institutional pressure keeps reappearing under different surfaces. Personal brilliance can dominate the scene, while institutional design determines whether the scene can be repeated after that brilliance weakens, disappears, or changes hands. The distinction matters here. That is why we are not asking whether leaders matter. We are asking what kind of structure their leadership leaves behind for everyone else to inhabit. The distinction matters here. Success in the short run can hide a delayed weakness if the system still depends on habits, permissions, or loyalties that only one person knows how to coordinate. The thesis, then, is deliberately simple to state and much harder to build in practice. Effective leadership over a fragmented coalition may depend less on issuing stronger commands and more on structuring incentives so rival. Begin with the basic reality. A coalition leader governs actors who are useful precisely because they are not fully absorbed. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. That means a rival faction cannot be treated like a clerk in a neat hierarchy. It carries its own followers, memory, pride, and exit options. That is the mechanism. So the first tool is selective concession. The center gives enough room, honor, revenue, or local influence to make participation preferable to rebellion. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. The second tool is reciprocal obligation. Cooperation becomes sticky when each faction can point to benefits it will lose if the arrangement breaks. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. A third tool is controlled competition. Rivals who all depend on the center and all watch each other often become easier to manage than one unified bloc facing the ruler alone. This does not mean the center wants chaos. It wants rivalry inside a framework that still requires appeal to the center. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. Recognition matters here. Titles, marriages, ceremonial placement, and access can all function as political currency when raw coercion is too expensive or too destabilizing. That is the mechanism. Distance also matters. A coalition often survives because local elites keep enough dignity to sell cooperation to their own followers as prudence, not surrender. That is the mechanisms. That is why over-centralization can be self-defeating. If the center humiliates every partner equally, it may accidentally create the unity it was trying to prevent. That is the mechanism. At the same time, under-centralization is dangerous too. If every faction believes it can ignore consequences, the coalition becomes a temporary convenience, not an order. That is the mechanism. The leader therefore spends energy not only commanding but also sequencing favors, timing punishments, and reminding rivals that the alternative to cooperation is costlier instability. That is the mechanism. Trust in this setting is rarely sentimental. It is often strategic trust built from repeated exchanges that convince rivals the bargain will outlast one meeting. That is the mechanism. Information flow is part of the mechanism as well. A center that hears only what one faction wants it to hear becomes easier for that faction to capture. So durable coalition leadership requires multiple channels, overlapping relationships, and visible proof that no partner can monopolize access to the ruler. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. The goal is not friendship. It is a political geometry in which factions remain separate enough to need the center and rewarded enough to keep choosing the coalition over fracture. A counterpoint is that some coalitions appear stable mainly because one dominant faction intimidates the rest, making incentive design look more elegant than it really is. The limits still matter. The limitation is that coalition structures vary widely and the meaning of concession, prestige, or autonomy changes with social scale, geography, and institutional depth. The limits still matter. Coalition management can also fail when the ruler rewards short-term loyalties so erratically that every faction concludes opportunism is safer than patience. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. There is a rational exception in moments of external danger, when even rivals with little love for the center may cooperate because collapse looks worse than compromise. The limits still matter. Effective coalition management is not the same as moral legitimacy. A ruler can skillfully coordinate rivals while still preserving coercive or exclusionary arrangements. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. Even so, the conceptual pattern remains strong. When participation offers status, protection, and bounded advantage that defection would jeopardize, fragmented orders often hold longer than pure command language would predict. Taken together, those boundaries do not erase the mechanism. They stop us from mistaking one useful explanation for a complete and universal theory of power. The limits still matter. So we can now return to the opening question with sharper terms, less mythology, and a clearer view of what the institution was actually carrying. That is the bounded answer. Leaders held rival coalitions together more successfully when they made the center the safest broker of status, reward, and dispute resolution, so that continued cooperation remained more attractive than testing open defection. In that sense, leadership is partly the craft of shaping conditions under which authority can move, persist, and still look usable after the central figure changes. That is the bounded answer. When that design fails, successors inherit titles, offices, or territories without inheriting the machinery that once made them governable. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality-based reading. When the design holds, conflict, rivalry, or uncertainty can remain because people still expect the institution to continue tomorrow. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality reading. The real measure, then, is not whether a ruler ever looked powerful. It is whether the system learned how to keep functioning when power had to travel through other hands. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate questions, yet both influence whether authority can endure without immediate collapse, improvisation, or deeper coercion. That is the bounded answer. The explanation still holds. That is the resolution. Durable leadership builds arrangements stronger than presence, while brittle leadership leaves everyone waiting for a person who is no longer enough. That is the bounded answer. Once that becomes visible, the topic stops looking like pageantry and starts looking like a disciplined question about structure, incentives, continuity, and institutional memory. That is the bounded answer. Study the architecture of command by asking who still has leverage even while appearing subordinate. That question pushes attention back towards structure instead of mythology when we evaluate leadership under stress. Authority moves through institutions, but in coalition settings it also moves through bargains, recognition, and repeated exchanges of safety. Ask the structural question. Look at the institution. Remove the ceremonial surface, and the question becomes which faction gains by keeping the coalition alive tomorrow. Ask the structural question. Look at the institution. This outcome cannot be reduced to one leader, one battle, or one speech. The center survives by shaping incentives across many proud intermediaries. Ask the structural question. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy are separate questions, yet coalition durability often depends on whether rivals believe the shared arrangement remains less costly than its breakdown. The practical reframing is to ask which role, routine, office, coalition, expectation, or resource channel is carrying the system when personal certainty begins to fade. The safer historical question is not who seemed most impressive in the moment, but which structure kept functioning when pressure rose and authority had to travel farther. The unresolved dilemma remains how a center keeps ambitious rivals close enough to cooperate without ever becoming so weak that those rivals stop needing it. Keep that question in view the next time a political story turns structure into personality and contingency into myth. The throne changes, the strategy remains. Until next time.